Grandparenting experience and its developmental significance. This is a report of a project by myself, Susan Moore, and my colleague Doreen Rosenthal. The aim of this study was to document the experiences of modern Australian grandmothers and grandfathers, including what is expected of the grandparent role, the perceived benefits, drawbacks, stresses, conflicts of the grandparenting role, how grandparents learn to be grandparents, and how grandparenting changes you. We used several theoretical frameworks in developing this study. First, we read a little about evolutionary theory, particularly in relation to grandmothers. It's been postulated that it's been a human advantage for women to survive well past childbearing age. This doesn't happen in many other species, because those that do are able to assist their daughters in the nurture of a new generation. And back in the caveman days, this was very useful. So those long-living women passed on genes, helped their daughters rear their children, and those genes were maybe passed on. So that gives us an idea that perhaps the nurture that grandmothers show is perhaps part of our genetic inheritance. Who knows? A second model was developmental theory. We were looking at grandmotherhood as a stage of life, a life transition that will require some new learnings, bringing to bear some old learnings, so some new learnings, and some adjustments to new relationships and a new stage of life. We're interested also in attachment theory. We know from attachment theory that we relate to others, we mother or we grandmother or we grandfather, as we were parented. If we have a secure base for our relationships development, then that will most likely be passed on. There is also opportunity as you go through life to break maladaptive family patterns. So just because you were not parented well doesn't mean you won't be able to parent well, or if you didn't parent well, maybe you can change in the grandparenting role. And finally, we're interested in looking at feminism, third wave feminism. We know that today's grandmothers will be different from our own grandmothers, that they'll be more independent, more likely to have a job, etc., etc. And we wondered, will they be too busy to nurture? We approached this project from several different frameworks. We looked at evolutionary theory, which postulates that human beings have an evolutionary advantage. We're one of the few species where women survive well past childbearing age, and this provides advantage to the species because these older women help their daughters nurture the new generation, particularly helpful in Stone Age primitive people, where if there was an older woman looking after the parent as she bore the child, this was going to increase survival. Also interested in developmental theory. Becoming a grandmother is a life transition. It's going to require new learning and adjustment. It's got potential stresses and strains. It's not something we necessarily choose. How do women cope with that? Attachment theory is another approach. We can say on the basis of our early attachments that our later attachments may well be influenced. So will we mother or grandmother as we were ourselves mothered and build on those models? But we also know from attachment theory that there is the opportunity to break maladaptive family patterns. So we're interested to see how women reflected back on their own parent and being grandparented, and how this shaped their own grandmothering. And we're also interested from the feminist point of view. We know that today's grandmothers are going to be probably much more educated, more likely to be independent and working than their grandmothers were? Will they be too busy to nurture? Let's just take a moment to have a look at grandparenting then and now. In this talk, I really am going to focus more on grandmothers, so I'll talk more about grandmothering then and now. These days, there are more single-parent families, more blended families, and households are generally smaller than in our mother's time or our grandmother's time. My mother, for example, had 5 sisters, and I've only one brother. There's less extended family living nearby for many families than there once was. Neighbourhood support for child rearing is different from how it was in our mother's and grandmother's day. Maybe if in our grandmother's day, if grandmother wanted to go to the shops, then the neighbour would look after the children. That doesn't happen anymore, or rarely. Families are more mobile, so they're more likely to be moving away from the extended family. And in the grandparenting generation, older women are more likely to be working, independent, healthy, and with their own interests, and maybe saying, I'm not ready to go back, I don't want to go back to doing the parenting, I've done the parenting. We were interested in finding that out. Another issue is that women have their first child later these days. They often want to continue in the workforce, so they may be looking more to mothers to do childcare than might have been the case when most mothers stayed home with young infants. But the expectations of grandmother's role may differ across generations. Grandma may not feel the same way about what she wants to do as mother does. When you look at the stereotype of grandmothering, it can be a bit daunting. One of our grandmothers thought, as it says on the slide, I thought grandmothers were these little old ladies who often played bowls. They had blue hair. They were lovely, but they weren't quite of this world. What they said just didn't amount to too much. Their role was to bake bread and be nice. And journalist Natalie Angier said in 2002 that when a woman is described as grandmotherly in press reports, it's tantamount to describing her as kindly, frail, harmless, keeper of the family antimacassars, and operationally past tense. Pretty daunting, and perhaps not the kind of stereotype that a modern senior woman wants to live up to. Anyway, on to our study. With the aim, as I've mentioned before, we created a web-based survey that could also be completed in hard copy. This was a survey designed for grandmothers. We've later done one on grandfathers. And we advertised the survey availability in seniors magazines across the country. We didn't actually pay for ads. We rang up the press offices and they did little articles about our study. And so we had little pieces about the study on seniors' websites and in magazines. And we also put a piece in our alumni websites on our universities. And so that was how we sent the survey out into the world, designed for grandmothers. We also conducted in-depth interviews with a subsample of grandmothers that we surveyed, and a little bit more detail about that. Here's an example of the kind of article that went into the press to advertise our survey. Now, what was in the survey? We had a simple measure of life satisfaction. We asked about satisfaction with grandparenthood, and we had a scale measuring generativity, which is the feeling that you've contributed in the world, that your life has been worthwhile or is worthwhile. We also asked about activities engaged with grandchildren, benefits and difficulties of grandparenthood, and as well as some the closed-ended questions and the scales, we also asked some open-ended questions. What are the best things about grandmothering. What are the worst things? What advice would you give a new grandmother? What would you change? Do you have any conflicts with the other parents or with your children or with the grandchildren? What's the nature of those? Compare yourself with your own mother and your own grandmother in the terms of how you are as a grandmother. In the interview, which was with the subsample of those we surveyed, we went into a bit more depth. We explored feelings about first becoming a grandparent, views on the role of a grandparent, issues of discipline, whether grandparents have favourites, how they cope with that, relationships with the grandchild's parents, how did you learn to become a grandparent, a comparison of your role as a grandparent with your parents and grandparents in this role, changes with ageing, etc., etc. So those interviews went on for an hour or an hour and a half and were quite in-depth. Our sample of grandmothers ended up quite large. We ended up with 1,205 grandmothers filling out the survey, and when I say filling it out, I mean doing all of it or most of it. And amazingly, over 90% responded online. We thought that this might not be the case. We thought that many would want the hard copies of the questionnaire, and we printed up lots and lots. And though we had some asking for these, most did the survey online. The average age of the women who completed the survey was 63.5, but the range was 34 to 92 years. Amazing. The young woman, a 34-year-old grandmother, we didn't get to interview her, unfortunately, but she was our youngest grandmother. 75% of these women were partnered, 10% had children still living with them. The average age of first becoming a grandmother for this sample was 53, with a range of 33 to 78. A little bit more about the grandmothers. The average number of grandchildren that they had was 4, so we did have grandmothers who were, really in there doing things, but the range was 1 to 22. These were Australian grandmothers, and we did our study from Melbourne, Victoria. So most of our sample, maybe 65%, was from Victoria. But because we got media coverage of the study, all Australian states were represented. So it was a widespread sample of Australian grandmothers. If there was some bias, it would have been in the education level. 75% of these women were educated beyond secondary school, so the results need to be considered in light of that. Interestingly, nearly 80% of them were working, mostly were working part-time, but 30% were working full-time. And the average time per week they spent with grandchildren was 12 hours. Now, that was not necessarily looking after them. That could have been just being with them, being with the family. The range was no time at all. There were some grandmothers who were not able to see their grandchildren for one reason or another, maybe because of distance, maybe because of relationship breakdown or difficulties. And we also had some full-time carers in our sample. Now, with respect to those that we interviewed, at the end of our survey we asked, would you be prepared to be interviewed for this study, and if so, send your details. Well, we had hundreds. We had to take that part of the questionnaire away eventually, and because we only had funds to interview a small number. Our aim was to interview a range of different types of grandmothers. So we had some older ones and some younger ones, some with just one grandchild and some with many. We tried to get some grandmothers and some regional or rural living grandmothers, some who were very hands-on, who saw their grandchildren many hours a week, and some who were more distant. We tried to interview some step-grandparents as well as biological grandparents, some who were partnered and some who were not partnered. We had, in our sample of interviewees, a couple of custodial carers, although neither were full-time in that role, and we also had a lesbian mother. this was the outcome of our study. And obviously I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this today, but our book is called New Age Nanas, Being a Grandmother in the 21st Century, and it is available on Amazon. Mostly what I'll talk about today is some of the qualitative data on how grandmothering changes you. It's an interesting role in it. It's not one that you can choose for yourself. You can choose to parent. Well, not everybody does, but you can just about choose to parent, but you really cannot choose to grandmother or grandparent. And some women said that before they became grandmothers, they worried about the associated stereotypes of ageing, or that expectations of them as a grandmother would be difficult to fulfill, or that they'd lose precious and hard-won me time. So there were some concerns. But there was a great deal of consensus that once it happened, those concerns went away. It wasn't always the case. There were some families with a great deal of tension, but in the majority of cases, grandmothers spoke about being overwhelmed with positive emotions. One of them, Barbara, said when she sees her toddler grandson, it's just nanny, and he comes racing in and hugs and kisses you. It's that open affection. It's the affection that a grandchild gives you. It's just so open, and there's no strings attached. It's just there. What outweighs that? Nothing. And of interest to us, and really the topic of this talk, was that grandparenting, women describe their grandparenting as providing to them many significant and life-enhancing benefits. We already know that being a grandparent, a committed grandparent, is good for children and it's helpful for parents, but not many studies have talked about how it's also good for grandparents. One of the things was talked about was that becoming a grandparent provides the opportunity for life review and renewal and can give you some new perspectives. Isabel said, "It's definitely changed my life. It keeps me in touch with what young people are doing. It stops me getting stuck in my own little world and becoming a stodgy old woman." And on those same lines, Sarah said, "It's really changed my perspective on things. It's made me see how unimportant certain things are in comparison with the grandchildren. So I've got new perspective on what's important and what's not." Another aspect of becoming a grandmother in this case, was that it involved new learnings, and learnings that were helpful to the sense of self. So women talked about learning from the past, of their own experiences of being mothered and being grandmothered, to shape a new role for themselves. So they were actively working on this new role. Emily said, "How did I learn to be a grandmother? I guess watching my mother and my gran. She was kind and considerate and loved spending time with us." So in Emily's case, she looked back on positive role models and shaped her own behaviour on these. But this wasn't always the case. Sometimes, as we mentioned with respect to attachment theory, there were not such good models that had to be thought about and changed. So Pam said, "Well, I didn't learn how to be a grandmother from my mother, just the opposite. My mother and father retired to a country house with white carpet and glass shelving with delicate vases on them, just at the level to attract small children. So it was horrendous going down to visit her, and yet she would complain if we didn't. And she had also said to me when I had 2 young children, a toddler and a baby, 'Don't ask me to babysit, I've brought up all my kids.'" So Pam was thinking back on this relationship, and she was making decisions. She was going to be a different kind of mother. One thing many women mentioned was that becoming a grandmother gives you the chance to support your children and relate to them in a new way. And Barbara, again, reflecting on her relationship with her daughter, said, "It's interesting the way it's changed. We're closer because we're more like peers. We see each other as women. She's separate from me now. It's like she doesn't have to fight for it. Growing up, independence, individualising, whatever you like to call it. She's very confident in herself, and it's safe now just to use me as a resource. So Barbara could see that relationship changing in very positive and mature ways. And it wasn't just relationships with daughters. Laura also was very amazed or very happy to see how her son had taken on the parenting role. And she commented on the whole generation. It's not just my son Simon. I've noticed this with the sons of my friends as well. They're just so hands-on, so committed, so in touch, so different to the previous generation. One of the aspects of being a grandparent that many grandparents mentioned was this thinking through a longer-term perspective on life and developing that sense of continuity across the generations. It's not even so much developing it as strengthening that sense of continuity. And Jenny explained how she did this with her grandson. She says, I read to him every night, but also tell him about his family. You know, this is where Daddy went to school, this is where Nana went to school, this is where such and such happened. I'm just sort of building up that idea of where you come from, because I think that a lot of my role is sharing those family stories. Now, Jenny was a custodial grandmother, and she had a very difficult role, but she was throwing herself into it with great gusto and warmth. On the lighter side, many grandmothers talked about their grandmothering as providing for them a new excuse to be happy and have fun. Some examples, Sarah says, my grandson says, pick me up, Nanny, so I pick him up and he says, now, Nanny, run, Pa, chase. And there's this little tiny person who's got two really semi-intelligent professional grandparents running around the house chasing each other while he says, run faster. Or we take him for a walk and a car goes past and he says, quick, Nan, run, chase the car. And Nanny runs and chases the car. So lots of fun, lots of joy. Despite those awful stereotypes I talked about at the beginning of the talk, grandmothers often found grandmothering actually an antidote for ageing, and they cited it as a reason to stay fit and healthy. Lucy says it does make you feel younger, definitely, and have a different outlook on the future because you're having so much fun. And one of our survey respondents said, my sedentary lifestyle contributed to back problems and poor general health. Now I'm going to the gym to build strength and ability to keep up with the grandkids. So paradoxically, it was actually making men feel younger and behave in a younger way. Perhaps most importantly, women described grandmothering as a new opportunity for loving. Sally, who had 10 grandchildren, said, I'm not responsible for feeding them, clothing them, educating them, disciplining them, nothing. I've only got one job in life, and that's to love them. And Jenny said, I think as we go through middle age, we close ourselves up a bit, and a baby and a child just opens your arms back up. You know, you sort of embrace things again with a new energy. Looking at our quantitative data, we found that the women who were most satisfied with their grandmothering were those who had, not surprisingly, fewer conflicts about the role with parents, partners or other grandparents. They were more likely to be partnered, so these were the grandmothers who were able to share their experience with a pal. They were more satisfied if they did more things with their grandchildren, so the more activities and length of activities with grandchildren, the happier they were. They were more satisfied with their grandmothering if they were in better health, and the more hours they spent per week with the grandchildren, the more satisfied they were. And the one I just left out was they were also more satisfied if they had fewer sons' children as their grandchildren than daughters' children. This raises the issue of grandmothers' relationships with daughters and daughters-in-law, an interesting one that we will perhaps take up in another talk. And finally, satisfaction with grandmothering was not associated with age or with the number of grandchildren. The grandmothers who were less satisfied were not those who spent a long time with their grandchildren or many hours with their grandchildren, but those who didn't spend any. These ones were the most unhappy, who were for some reason estranged or unable to see their grandchildren. These were the least satisfied. In terms of life satisfaction and generativity, these and grandmother satisfaction were all predicted by fewer conflicts in the grandparent role, more activities done with the grandchildren, and better health. When we asked about the top perceived benefits of grandparenting, we've actually got the data here for grandmothers and grandfathers, though I haven't talked about the grandfather sample. The strongest one was it's fun. 78% of grandmothers said grandmothering is fun, provides opportunities for emotional closeness, helps me bring the family together, makes my life more meaningful, keeps me active, helps me understand the younger generation. There's the pleasure of indulging the younger generation, makes me feel useful. These were the top benefits perceived. And just contrasting those with the top perceived difficulties of grandparenting. If you think back at the percentages on the previous slide, you'll see they're all very high, but the percentages on the difficulty slide are not very high at all. In fact, the major difficulty that grandmothers wrote was none. But the major difficulty, the highest scoring one, was I live too far away to be involved as I'd like. Next one, 14%, limited financial resources to help. Then not enough time to help as much as I'd like, not enough time. Physical and health problems limit my involvement. That's only 6%. Grandchildren are too busy to spend time with me, 5%. Expectations of time I can spend are too high, 4%, nothing for grandfathers. Have to give up my own interests and activities, 3%, and feeling guilty over not fulfilling expectations, 5%. So the difficulties were only checked by a very small percentage of the sample of 1,200. Drawing it all to a conclusion, I guess we can say that grandmothering is a developmental transition in the lives of usually older women, mostly older women, and with all such transitions it has its difficulties and stresses, but it also provides the opportunity for life enhancement, greater maturity and satisfaction. The grandmothering-grandchild relationship works both ways. It's of benefit to the grandchild and if it's a benefit to the grandmother and hopefully to the parents as well. It's one of those relationships that is worth nurturing. Sometimes parents don't want to bother with it, but it works out well all the way round, in most cases, in strong families. Now, you can like us on Facebook at New Age Nanas, and as I mentioned before, our book, which was brought out last year, is available from Big Sky Publishing. In the US, you get it from Amazon.com, either as an e-book or a paperback. Thank you. Bye.